lesson here in Psalm 119, things seem to fit really well together. And so we've used those verses there, wanting to look here at Psalm 119 for what it looks like, what it means to love the Lord this way. Last week we started with that idea of loving the Lord with all our heart. And we'll review here in just a minute, but find your place there in Psalm 119. And then turn, if you would, to the book of 1 Kings. 1 Kings chapter number 14. The books of Kings come before the books of Chronicles. 1 Kings before 2 Kings, right? 1 Kings 14, what I'd like to do just really briefly, we won't spend a lot of time necessarily considering the examples, these men as an illustration of these things. But one of the questions that I found myself asking as I approached this idea of loving the Lord with all our heart, man, that sure sounds like a really good idea, doesn't it? Yet, I struggled. Can I love God that way? Is it really possible for us to have this whole heart kind of love for God and His ways? And that's what challenged me. Okay, let's see. Does the Bible talk about anybody that has loved God this way? And that brought me here to 1 Kings chapter number 14. One of the first places, there's one of the places in the book of Joshua. We'll look at it here in just a moment. In Joshua, I think it's chapter number 22, Joshua tells the people to love the Lord this way. Of course, we have the instruction there in the book of Deuteronomy that we're to love the Lord this way. But I wanted to know if it actually had been done. You know, sometimes we do a really good job of setting these ideals out there. Live this way, love God this way. And, struggling sometimes to keep things practical enough for us to actually be able to accomplish it. And so I came here to 1 Kings chapter number 14. The setting for this particular chapter is God speaking to Jeroboam, a man named Jeroboam. Jeroboam was a servant of Solomon who was really instrumental after Solomon passed off the scene. God split the kingdom of Israel. 10 tribes followed Jeroboam. This is that Jeroboam. In leaving Rehoboam, the Boam brothers, they weren't brothers, but Jeroboam, Rehoboam, the names sound the same there. Rehoboam remained as king there in the south. Jeroboam had 10 tribes of Israel and was their king in the northern part of the country. Jeroboam was not a godly man. He was not a good king. In fact, how Jeroboam leads these northern 10 tribes into idolatry and apostasy, rejecting God, rejecting God's way, will become a kind of the defining mark. All of the other kings of the northern tribes especially will be judged, will be condemned, because the Bible will say they continued in. God actually challenges them on that. Why did you do this? I handed you the kingdom, God says to Jeroboam, and you rejected what I wanted for you. And in this conversation between God and Jeroboam, God is going to mention an individual. In the context here, what we're looking at, this whole heart love for God. This is God speaking of how David actually did it. Look with me here at 1 Kings 14, verse number 8. 1 Kings chapter 14, verse number 8. Again, God is speaking to Jeroboam here in this verse. And he's talking about how he had rent the kingdom away. And that's the northern 10 tribes away from the house of David. God gave it to Jeroboam. And yet, thou hast not been as my servant David, who kept my commandments. Notice these next couple of phrases. And who followed me with all his heart. I think what we have here, notice the last phrase there. It's interesting what two things are mentioned in this verse in the same connection here with loving God this way, following God this way. David kept his commandments. He wanted to do that only kind of testimony. God himself says, I know David's heart. He wanted to do only that which was right in my eyes. If David could do it, chapter number 23. This has probably got to be one of my favorite stories in this time period of Israel's divided monarchy. Jeroboam was the king in the northern 10 tribes. Israel, these northern 10 tribes never had a godly king. The southern 2 tribes would have periods of revival. They would have some very wicked kings from time to time. But there was a greater desire at times to come back to doing what God had asked of them. As we approach the end of this period of the divided monarchy, of course we know Babylon is going to come in and wipe out the southern tribes. There are these 2 tribes. God is going to use Assyria and Babylon as means of judgment against his people. We're very near, in the history of things, very near those things happening. And a young man named Josiah. Of course, does anybody know Josiah's claim to fame? He was 8 years old when he became king. That's, to put that in perspective, that's Ben's age. Now, Ben would think it was totally cool to be king. But can you imagine being that age and being put in as king of God's people? It took a few years, and it's interesting to chart out the ages, how old Josiah was when some of these things were happening here. The Bible says after he had reigned for 8 years. So he's now 16. That's Micah's age, which is an even scarier prospect, having Micah as king, right? It's interesting when you read the Bible and you've lived a little bit here and you're starting to put things in perspective here. It's just really, Micah? No way, that just wouldn't work. I can say that. He's not here this morning. He's out at camp having a great time. Pray for the kids. Brooke, Micah, and Lydia are still out at Kobiak here this week for their second week of what they call leadership camp out there. They'll be working this week as part of the program staff or junior counselors. We're working with the young people. They are really towards the end, I guess it'll be towards the middle of the chapter here. And we're going to have a little bit of, and he will realize just how far Israel had, these southern 2 tribes, Judah, had gotten away from what God expected of them. And he will lead the nation to revival, to return to God. So complete, so pure was Josiah's heart towards God, that God, before Josiah became king, God was ready to wipe Judah off the face of the planet. He was ready for Babylon to come in and destroy them. Judgment was there. And because of Josiah and his heart for God, God said, that judgment is still coming, but I'm going to let you be king, and you're going to die in peace before this judgment comes. God's long-suffering there because of Josiah. I want you to see what this says here of Josiah in verse number 25. Don't read this verse lightly. The Bible's making some pretty significant claims here. All his soul and with all his might. That's interesting, isn't it? According to all the law of Moses, neither after him arose there any like him. After him arose there any like him. Josiah had every reason in the world to not turn to God. The couple of kings before Josiah were not good, godly kings. Josiah, his people, I can imagine as a young person how much Josiah must have struggled. And yet this is what God points out here. In the same language that we're speaking of from Deuteronomy or from Luke that Jesus would speak of here, using the same language. This is it. This young man, when he knew, when he understood, when he was confronted with what God wanted for him, says, yeah,